All right, welcome back to the watercolor studio. Okay, so let's talk about what you're going to do next. Placed in front of you here now, you're going to notice your upcoming assignment. So it's divided into 3 quadrants. Number 1 is our color wash chart. Number 2 is our value scale. And number 3 is our shadow sphere. So this is how I want you to divide out the assignment. Those of you that ended up getting like the Strathmore watercolor pad or something like that, feel free to rip out a sheet. Those of you that ended up getting the Blick kit or the Tacoma Artist and Craftsman kit, what you're going to do is you're going to take one of those large sheets of watercolor paper, you're going to fold it in half, and you're going to cut it. And I'll have a little description on Canvas for you there. So you're going to end up with something that's like this. This is what we call a half sheet of watercolor paper. And then I want you to take that half sheet and divide it in half. And in this case, I just ended up using a ruler because I'm really lazy. I didn't want to do the measurements. And I just ended up tracing the width of the ruler. So whatever the width of this ruler is what I use to make my squares. Probably an inch if I had to guess. So these are 1 inch by inch squares. And you're going to grid off 1/2 of your paper. The other half, you're going to leave room for a value chart. And you're also going to leave a little bit of room for your shadow sphere. And those are going to be your first 3 watercolor assignments that you're going to be instructed on as we proceed. Okay, so for now, I just want to focus on this color wash chart. So I'm going to cover it up with our washes here that we're going to learn and practice on our color chart. So you're going to learn these 5 different techniques. Technique number 1 is referred to as a flat wash. Technique number 2 is wet into wet. Technique number 3 is a glaze wash. Technique number 4 is a bleed wash or fade wash. And number 5 is the dry brush technique. And that's what these little squares are going to come into play here for, is so you can practice these different techniques. What you're going to need is some kind of a container of water. I have a little camping cup that's a collapsible silicone cup that I happen to like to use quite a bit. And I have my palette right over here on the far corner, clamped up there so you can see how I'm using that. You're going to need, I would recommend trying to use a flat brush and a round brush as you're doing this exercise so you can get comfortable. Now I know some of you are going to be waiting on materials, and that's okay. Just use what you have. If you have your kneaded eraser, this is what you want to use to do all your erasing. So it's real stretchy, and as it gets dirty, you can just clean it out like this. And the nice thing is if you get really bored, you can start to become a sculptor and make a little face or whatever, okay? Anyway, so it's pretty fun. And that's what you want to use because a regular eraser will damage the fibers of your watercolor paper. It's infinitely better to use that kneaded eraser. So try not to use a pink pearl eraser or something like that unless it's kind of a dire emergency kind of scenario. And a little mister bottle, something like this. This is something I acquired in the travel section at the dollar store. You know, it works great. Just fill this up with water, and then when it comes time to paint, you can just go ahead and mist your watercolors. Now the thing I would mention is, those of you that ended up getting the kit, you're going to have a plastic watercolor palette, and you're going to have tubes of paint. So take those tubes of paint, and you're going to fill up your watercolor pans there, and try to use about 1/3 or so of that watercolor tube and fill it up, and make sure all your colors are grouped. So all your reds are by each other, all your oranges are by each other, and all your greens are by each other, and so on. And it doesn't take a lot of watercolor. A little bit of watercolor goes a long ways. So if you're used to acrylic or oil, you don't use it the same way. You're just using a little bit of watercolor and quite a bit of water. So I'm going to use my palette. Here's a mixing surface that will suffice just fine for what we're doing today. That's a couple of things you might want to have. Now if you make a mistake and you have a paper towel like a Viva paper towel handy, you can still blot something and lift it up, and you can make a recovery that way. So that might be another thing that you might want to have close by. So let's go ahead and jump on in here into the wash chart. That's going to be your first assignment. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here, so if you'll bear with me for a second, just so you get a little bit better look at one of these squares here, maybe the watercolor palette. That might be a little bit better vantage point for you. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to do a flat wash. So I'm just going to choose one of my squares. By the way, I just used a pencil. You can just use a pencil to do a drawing and then paint over the top. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select a color and to lay down a nice flat wash. So our goal here is to have, and I did a couple that are now dry just to show you, but our goal is to try to create a nice wash that's nice and even and flat, and we control exactly where that watercolor goes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my brush wet, and my brush should be nice and wet and completely rinsed out so I don't have any paint. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select one of my squares. I'm going to lay that brush down, and here is where it's really, really critical, okay? I'm doing something pretty subtle. You might not notice right away, but what I'm doing is I'm laying down a layer of water on top of my watercolor paper, and I'm not lifting up, okay? Let me show you the difference. If I came in here and I did it again, and I went like this, and I kind of pecked at the surface, that might be the way that you are familiar with working, whether it's oil paint or acrylic or something like that. When we're doing a flat wash, you don't want to do that. You want to keep the water in a nice even film across the surface of your paper without lifting up. Okay, so whatever it takes, just leave that brush down on the surface without lifting up. Okay, so now I've pre-saturated my area. I'm going to go ahead and just choose a little bit of violet here, okay, as my color. And again, a little bit of watercolor goes a long ways. So you see I've hardly used any watercolor plus a little bit of water. So now I'm going to come into this square that I've already pre-wetted. And the nice thing is that since it's pre-wetted, I can control exactly where that watercolor is going to go. It's just going to adhere to those areas that are wet. And see, I'm making a big effort not to lift up on the brush. And by so doing, I can get a really nice flat wash. Okay. And so that's my goal right there, is try to keep it as flat and as smooth as possible without lifting up on my brush. If I do, the gravity is going to push all that water down, and we're going to end up with like a less than even distribution of our paint and water, and that's not our goal. We want a nice, even, flat wash. Okay, so again, how do you achieve the flat wash? Really easy, really simple. Pre-wetting your surface, and then you are going to not lift up your brush and lay down that area of pigment. Okay, let's move on to technique number 2. This is wet into wet. So same sort of thing. You can select maybe more than one box on this exercise if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and pre-wet in 2 boxes. Now, wet into wet is just so much fun. Okay, the way it works is I'm going to lay down some color like this, okay, and then I'm going to step away from it, all right? I don't want to overwork it. I'm just going to leave a little bit of color down there, same thing here, and just step away. And wet into wet is really loads of fun, because what you don't know necessarily is how it's going to turn out. But the great thing is, as these colors blend together, grab a little bit more pigment here. As these colors blend together, they're going to dry and do all sorts of really, really cool things. All right, so let's try that again. I'm going to go ahead and pre-wet in another square. How about this one right here? Okay, you can get that nice and wet and juicy with some good watercolor. Let's come in here and lay down some tones. All right, and it's a little bit difficult for this to take its full effect because of the slope that I have is pretty dramatic in order to produce the filming. But that's another thing we should talk about. When you set up, you might want to elevate your surface just a little bit, an inch or two, and then gravity will help do the rest of the work for you. So the fun thing with this wet into wet is you can just lay down the watercolor and kind of let it do let the watercolor do its own thing, what it's made to do. And that's really, really fun. Now, the problem is, I'm going to demonstrate what not to do. If you come in here when it's wet and you keep noodling it and you keep coming in here and manipulating it and going over it, what's going to happen is it's going to get gray, it's going to get muddy. And that's where most beginners get really frustrated, is that they're spending too much time coming in here and kind of noodling the color. All right, and you grab another color and you come back in here, it's going to get really noodled, it's going to get really grayed down, and it's going to look kind of dead. Okay, so the best wet into wet happens when you just lay it down, you walk away, let gravity do its thing, let the watercolor do its thing, and you get all these cool combinations where the watercolor is merging together, and it's really, really fun. And if you want to, you can use more than one square at a time. You could use 2 or 3 squares and kind of experiment and let those colors blend together naturally. Okay, that's technique number 2. Technique number 3 is what we refer to as a glaze wash. Now, I'm going to show you how a glaze works. Here is a flat wash that I completed earlier today, just in the interest of time, right? A glaze only works once you have ended up completing an area and it's dry. Otherwise, it's going to be a wet to wet wash, right? So this area is dry. Now I have a cool tone, so I'm going to have fun with temperature, and I'm going to take a warm tone right over the top. And this is the beauty of watercolor. It's transparent, okay? It's meaning you can see through that layer that's underneath. Isn't that exciting? Yeah, I love it. That's the great stuff right there. Once you start to lay down that glaze right over the top, again, same thing. I'm going to try not to lift up on my brush too much. I want a nice even layer of watercolor distributed across my original wash, my flat wash. Now, can you see how it's transparent? And that's actually coming through. I'll zoom in just a little bit and you can see a little bit better maybe. So you can see how that original area is taking the watercolor and exposing the layer that's underneath. And that's how you get darker values in watercolor. Watercolor, you have to work light to dark. It's always a formula of working light to dark, academically speaking. So if you want a really dark value, you might have to just glaze 3 or 4 times. But the cool thing is you're going to get those layers exposed each and every time. Okay. We're cruising here. Hang with me, okay? I know you can pause this video if you want to and work some of these techniques and resume it and review it. In fact, that's what I encourage you to do, because I am moving a little bit quickly, but I know you guys can keep up. So here we go. We have technique number 4 coming back to our list right here. So you can see technique number 4. So far we've completed our flat wash, our wet into wet wash, our glaze wash, and now we're on to technique number 4, which is our bleed or fade wash. Okay, this one's a little bit trickier, but let me go ahead and explain how it works. I'm going to work in an area where I have several squares to choose from. So maybe let me find this area down here where we can zoom in. Okay, so I'm going to work this area right here. My goal is to say, maybe my goal is to have a sky. So I'm going to take these 4 squares right here, and my goal is to create a sky. So I'm going to have a darker value at the top and a lighter value as I transition further down on my composition, much like how the horizon works, or atmospheric perspective. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean out my brush, get it nice and clean here. Okay, and I'm going to pre-wet just the top of these 4 squares, just like this. Okay, my goal is to get a fade. So I want a nice gradation where it's darker here and lighter as I go down, okay? So for now, I'm just gonna lay down a little bit of water right here, okay? I'm gonna grab the sky blue or whatever that I wanna paint, okay? And then I'm gonna go ahead and proceed to lay down a wash, just like a flat wash right here, okay? I might saturate it with just a little bit more paint. How does that sound? There, now we're in business, okay? So I'm gonna make this a little bit darker, okay? I'm gonna fill in that area that's nice and wet and juicy. Okay, now I'm gonna come out and I'm gonna clean out my brush. I now am going to basically almost paint with just water, right? So now I have very little pigment here at all, and I'm having the watercolor naturally pull itself down, okay? So I have a lot darker value here. As it dries, this color is going to be pulled down here and I'll have a nice gradient. Again, be careful not to overwork this too much, but I do need to pull this pigment down just a little bit further. Again, notice what I'm doing. I'm not lifting up on my brush. That is the biggest key. If you can learn something today, the biggest takeaway is just try not to lift up on your brush. Leave that brush down on the surface and you're going to get nice flat washes that way. Okay, so it might be a little hard to detect in the video, but you can see I have a little bit darker value transitioning to a much lighter value right here. And that is our technique number 4, our bleed wash or fade wash, okay? And I'll post this up on Canvas so you have it as an additional review, okay? Now, next I'm going to go ahead and cover our last technique. Woohoo! I know you're excited. All right, last technique, number 5. Drum roll, please. Okay, so technique number 5, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how the dry brush works. The dry brush is probably the most difficult technique. I just put another sheet of paper up here because it's going to be a little bit easier for you to see it rendered in a large space, okay? So the dry brush technique often takes place over another layer of watercolor in sort of like a glaze fashion. It works really well if you're doing something like, say, textures on the rocks or texture on an old wooden barn. Okay, but the thing you really need to do is have a paper towel or something that you can blot handy and close by, and you're going to control the moisture in your brush. Okay, so I'm going to take most of the moisture out of my brush like this. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here, I'm going to select some watercolor, and I don't want it to be real runny and wet necessarily, but I'm just basically kissing the watercolor. And so I'm not sure how well you'll be able to make this out in the camera, but I'm just saturating a little bit of pigment in the ends of the bristles of my brush. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lightly put my brush down here and I get this nice broken effect or line. Let me try doing that again here for you. I probably should have grabbed a little bit larger brush, but we're going to make this work just so you can see. Okay, so it's sort of subtle, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to really lightly, oops, so you can see too much moisture in that start right there. So that wasn't a good example, but this is better. Okay, see how we've got a little bit of a broken texture that's starting to develop. A bigger brush is a little bit easier with this technique. I definitely am using, there we go, I'm using a really pretty small brush for this, just but we'll make it work here. So those aren't spectacular examples. Let me give it one more try here and see if I can't get a better result. Okay, here we go. It's still a little wet. So that's my apology on that one there for being just a little bit oversaturated. I think this is going to be it. I know the excitement's killing everybody. Let's see if we can get it. So you can see this was why I left this technique for the very end, because it's a little tricky. What you're looking for are these little broken scumble marks that can add texture across that. And maybe I'll take some pictures and post them on Facebook too. But the way you're going to get there, or on Canvas, sorry. What you're going to do is you're going to just have a really dry brush and you're going to try to manipulate that texture to where you get these broken areas of value. So there we go. Okay, sorry, that might have been off camera a little bit. Drats.